Once Germany had officially split into East and West Germany, the Americans realized that we needed an organization, specifically within Europe, that could help to protect our allies both economically as well as militarily. As such, we created an organization known as NATO, which we've already mentioned. NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was formed both in order to make sure that all countries had non-entangled alliances. If you were in NATO, you were all friends with each other. We pledged to defend each other in case of an outside attack. But it also was an economic agreement, kind of like another one of those Kroger Plus card clubs, where if you were a member of it, you did receive some discounts in terms of trade and tariffs. The unexpressed goal of NATO, however, was to keep the United States in and powerful within Europe, Germany down in Europe in order to prevent another world war, and Russia out of Europe. Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had distinguished himself during the D-Day invasion and would later become the 34th President of the United States, was named as the first Supreme Commander of NATO, and one of his first things that he did was to send American troops into Europe in order to maintain a military presence. The USSR is, of course, going to respond. In 1955, they create their own group that at first was the Eastern Bloc countries and eventually becomes known as the Warsaw Pact. Now, Asia is going through, in general, a giant communist revolution of its own. China is one of those big, huge, powerful countries that we haven't really mentioned much about. And what you're going to see is that within China, as well as many other Asian nations, the Cold War is actually fairly hot, where you have the communists of the areas versus the non-communists of the areas actually full-on fighting each other. China historically had been ruled by a bunch of different dynasties, the Qing dynasty being one of the last ones. In 1911, revolutionary forces are going to try to overthrow the Qing dynasty because they feel that it was corrupt, and that you could argue that one way or the other. This revolution is going to fail. However, in 1917, a group of people known as the Bolsheviks are going to lead a successful revolution in Russia where they overthrow the Tsarist regime. The Tsar family, in this case the Romanovs, had ruled Russia for hundreds of years, and they're going to be overthrown by these Bolsheviks who were communist supporters of a man by the name of Vladimir Lenin. And that's where communism gets its start in Russia. Inspired by this, the Chinese Communist Party, which is going to start with mostly college students, is going to once again reform, and they're going to declare an all-out civil war against the nationalists of China, who are those who favored the historic dynasty. The nationalists were led by a leader named Chiang Kai-shek, and he was the leader of what was called the Kuomintang Party, which is the official name for the nationalists of China. The Civil War is going to last for about 20 years, but then when World War II broke out, the two are going to work together, both the nationalists as well as the communists, in order to prevent Japan from taking over the country. When World War II ends, the communists feel as though they had done the bulk of the work during the war. And so they are going to try once again to take over the power of the country. And they're led by an enigmatic leader by the name of Mao Zedong, who you see pictured here. Mao was such an inspirational leader that he's going to engage in a series of reforms known as the Great Leap Forward. And these reforms are going to do everything from giving land to the poor peasants who previously had had none, as well as various other governmental reform policies. And this is going to increase the number of people who supported the communists. So the Civil War is going to heat right back up. We are going to send some economic and military aid to help the nationalists, but not enough. And so by 1949, Mao Zedong is going to be able to have successfully taken over the country. Chiang Kai-shek is going to lead the Kuomintang and nationalists to the nearby island of Taiwan. To this day, we do not recognize China as the official government of China. We recognize the nationalists as Taiwan as the legal government, and vice versa. China does not recognize Taiwan as being anything other than kind of like the stepchild that is, treated differently. The Chinese and Taiwan to this day have great issues. But this is where communism sets in China. Korea is going to be the next Asian country to experience a communist revolution. Here's what happens with Korea. Korea had belonged to Japan. It had belonged to different countries for hundreds and hundreds of years, but in 1910, Korea had fallen to Japan as a colony. After World War II, as punishment for losing the war, Japan loses most of its colonies, in this case including Korea. The Korean peninsula itself was divided into two different spheres of influence along what was called the 38th parallel. And this was because the people in the northern section of the country had been heavily influenced by the communists in China. The people in the southern part were heavily influenced by Japan and also by the United States. And so the decision was made that the two would be temporarily divided along the 38th parallel until elections could be held among the entire peninsula that would establish which government system would have the rule of the peninsula. The problem was that the leader in the north, a guy by the name of Kim Il-sung, is going to declare the elections to occur earlier than the United Nations had agreed on. This is going to catch the non-communists by surprise, and therefore they're not able to vote. As such, these rigged elections guaranteed that the North win the elections. So the North votes, and they all vote that the entire peninsula should become a Southern Communist United country. The South had already chosen in its leader a man by the name of Simon Rhee, and he's going to say that these elections were fraudulent and should not be counted, should thrown out, and have new elections held. At this point, we had been withdrawing slowly. We had a military presence in Korea, but we figured that the elections would take care of everything. We wouldn't need to be present. But when the North Koreans go behind our back and have these, debatably fraudulent elections, we become very, very angry. With us gone, however, the North is able to sneak the elections, claim the results were legitimate, and invade the South on June 25th, 1950, in an ultimate quest to turn the entire peninsula into one communist bloc. The United Nations sees all this, and immediately they're going to freak out, and they're going to demand a ceasefire. We're going to ask the North pull back, try again, let's have real elections, and Truman is going to pledge U.S. military support for the South if the North doesn't comply. The North doesn't comply, of course. They're like, no, we had these elections, we won, don't tell us how to rule our country, we're going to rule ourselves. And so the Northern military is going to push all the way down to what's called Pusan Harbor. Truman's still president at this point, is going to order General Douglas MacArthur, who had distinguished himself in the Pacific during World War II, to help push the Northern troops back. 15 other United Nations are going to get involved, although it's going to largely still be the United States and South Korea doing the work. So the North had fake elections pushed all the way down to here, which is called Pusan Harbor. MacArthur is going to wind up launching a pretty successful insurgency where he's going to lead troops at Pusan as well as simultaneously at this port up here called Incheon. The idea is push the North Koreans back, and then there's American troops here waiting for them, so we'll be able to push them back more. So it's kind of like push, push, and it's like a double hit attack. And the goal of pushing the North all the way back. MacArthur wanted to go all the way to China and then bomb China. Truman just wanted them back across the 38th parallel. This double attack at Incheon and Pusan is going to occur in September of 1950. Now, mind you, at this point, we haven't officially declared war. We're just using our political ideologies to try to fight to free these independent countries. We, in particular, wanted to try to recapture the southern capital of Seoul and liberate it from the northern control, which we're going to do. By October, northern troops had been pushed all the way back to the Yalu River, that border with China. This is going to prompt China to get into the war, and they're going to take the side of the North, favoring those communist allies. So with China now involved, it's going to push the troops back to the 38th parallel. And really, for the next 3 years, this huge stalemate is going to occur right along the 30th parallel, where it's China and North Korea with a little bit of Russia versus the United States, South Korea, and several other United Nations. MacArthur does get himself in trouble. He very vocally criticizes Truman for not allowing him to bomb China. He figured if he had bombed China, and by bomb I probably mean atomic weaponry here, MacArthur had thought this would end the war quickly and we could move on, and perhaps it could weaken this communist stranglehold within China. But many Americans were nervous. They didn't want to attack China because they were scared that that would bring Russia more fully into the war, and Russia had nukes, and so everything was going to go to heck. And here's just some images so you can see this war going on. Truman is going to tell MacArthur that MacArthur has to back down. MacArthur very publicly is going to criticize Truman. And so as a result, Truman gets mad and fires the very popular general. He just fires him straight up from the military in April of 1951. MacArthur comes home to a hero's welcome, ticker tape parade and everything, and he makes a pretty famous speech. Included in it is the line that old soldiers never die, they just fade away. And so he too was going to fade away like the soldier in that famous song. So this is really going to hurt Truman's popularity, and that's going to come into play in the 1952 elections. Truman knew his popularity was very low, so he wasn't going to run for re-election, and instead the Democrats are going to put up a guy by the name of Adlai Stevenson. Adlai Stevenson, very good statesman, but his biggest problem was that he was incredibly intelligent. Most people refer to him as what's called an egghead because he was so smart. And he was so smart, he couldn't bring that intelligence down to, like, quote, normal people. And so people didn't understand what he was saying and what he was standing for. The Republicans are going to pick a very, very popular man by the name of, again, Dwight D. Eisenhower. He is going to pick Richard Nixon as a guy by the name of Richard Nixon, as his vice president. And the two of them are going to campaign on a platform of I will go to Korea. Between Eisenhower's heroism, his notoriety, his fame, as well as his more laid-back, everybody can understand me, and his military approach, it was a very easy win for the Republicans to take the 1952 election. So Eisenhower becomes president in 1952 in the middle of the Korean War. And here you can see this is Adlai Stevenson, Richard Nixon, and this is Dwight D. Eisenhower. One of the first things that Eisenhower is going to do upon taking office is he is going to keep his promise. He's going to go to Korea. He sees what it's like, and he's going to be able to help to negotiate an end to the Korean War, mainly by increasing bombs on the North Koreans to the point where they could not fight back. The North Koreans are a very poor nation in general. He also covertly, allegedly, threatens that he will nuke the country if they don't back down. So on July 27, 1953, North and South Korea agreed to an armistice, which is called a ceasefire, that divides the country along the demilitarized zone, which is still used to this day. The DMZ is just slightly off from the 38th parallel, but for the most part, it's along the same division. So this 3-year war ultimately results in very little land gain for either country. It's also important to note that over 54,000 Americans are killed in this war, 103,000 were wounded, and more than a million Asians between China, North and South Koreans were pretty much killed for nothing. But this is certainly where the hostilities between the United States and North Korea in particular that exist to this day were born. The ceasefire itself wasn't technically signed, and so for some people the war was still going on. However, we never actually declared war by Congress, and so we refer to this as the Korean Police Action. You ask the family of those 54,000 Americans who died, however, it is a war just like all others. And if you've ever seen the TV show MASH, this is the war that show is based on. So there are wars during the non-war time period, which seems really weird. If you're actually interested in the Korean War, please don't hesitate to ask, because it is my favorite war to study.